What's up, Barnhill family, and welcome back to your home for all things combat sports.
Yo.
So Khamzat Chimaev came out and told the UFC, hey, look, give me this guy, Alex Pereira. I want to finish him once and for all. I want to be the 205 champion. And, you know, at first blush, it's like, okay, why is Chimaev calling out the champion at light heavyweight when he literally just now is reinserting himself into the 185 picture? And I think it's because he realizes he's a worker. You know, he sort of looks at the landscape, sees where the next 6 months are headed, and then kind of calls his shots accordingly. And now that Dricus du Plessis has been given the nod over him to fight Sean Strickland in January, that kind of jams everything up at 185, at least for the first half or first quarter of 2024.
Right.
And if Dricus du Plessis is able to defeat Sean Strickland, then you have the potential of Israel Adesanya coming back and then making that mega fight. So it could be something that pushes Chimaev off until the end of next year. And at this point, he just wants a belt. He thinks he matches up well with Pereira. And whether it's a publicity stunt or not, just to stay in the headlines, I do think the call-out's compelling, and I do think the fight would actually be pretty fun.
Yeah, it would definitely be fun. The build-up would be great. And I think that Chimaev versus Pereira would be a very interesting fight to break down. Because you have to remember, even though Chimaev went out there and didn't finish Usman, he controlled the majority of that fight. And first round Khamzat Chimaev is maybe the most dominant fighter on the entire UFC roster. And if he's able to get in there and wrestle Alex Pereira down, which is a big opponent, it would be a tall task for him to do. But if he's able to do that and get him out of there with a slick submission early on, you're talking about some crazy stuff that we've never seen happen. A guy who originally came into the UFC looking to attack the 170 division, moving all the way up 35 pounds to take over the light heavyweight division and possibly become a champion. That would be crazy. It's a bit wishful thinking, and I don't really see that happening right now. I'd say at least one full calendar year before we see Chimaev enter the 205 world. But he's really smart to be doing this. As far as stealing headlines and as far as the media presence that Khamzat Chimaev knows how to take from all the other fighters, he's one of the best at it. He's really good at inserting himself into whatever conversation he needs to. If he needs to, just send a tweet out to a couple of 145ers, he'll do it. It doesn't really matter. He'll call out Brock Lesnar. He'll talk about whoever he needs to talk about to stay relevant. And I think that's really important for him because as a fighter, you only get so many times per year that you get to fight. And it's usually around a max of about 4. So that's 4 days of the year where you're able to stay in the headlines and stay relevant. And what you do with the other 360 plus days of the year is totally up to you. And if people are forgetting about you, it's not their fault, it's your fault. So I like that Chimaev's staying in the headlines. I agree with you that 185 all of a sudden just got a whole lot more interesting. And while he's a very hot commodity for the division, there are some things and some rites of passages as far as is he coming back, DDP getting the next title shot, that just stand in his way. And the best thing he can do to get himself closer to a title, even if it's just conversations, is to point his cannons at Alex Pereira.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to me because obviously nobody would argue that Khamzat Chimaev has substantially better wrestling and grappling than Alex Pereira.
Right.
We all know Alex Pereira's background, and he's as good as it gets when it comes to kickboxing. He's absolutely lights out. Just finished Yuri Prohaska with his pattern, striking. Right. So, but there does come a point where size matters. And there's a certain amount of technique that can overcome a certain amount of size. And that scale is always, tipping in either direction depending on who the two people you're talking about are. Obviously, Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson is not going to get in there and defeat Leon Edwards, even though he may be technically more proficient. It's just one of those things. And so you have to ask yourself, Chimaev being a good 30 to 40 pounds smaller than Alex Pereira, I think just from a natural frame point of view, is that too much size to overcome to where Pereira would actually be able to keep the fight on the feet just by default? Since he's so much bigger, a little takedown defense would go a long way against a much smaller opponent.
Right.
And if that were the case, I think it would be a very long or very short night for Khamzat Chimaev because I don't think he could withstand Pereira's power for 5 rounds. So it's interesting, and I think it would come down to, can Chimaev's wrestling and grappling tenacity and technique overcome the massive size difference and get Pereira to the ground? Because if he can, I believe he can finish Pereira. If he can't, I believe he will for sure be finished by Pereira.
Yeah, I have to agree with you on that. And while there's a lot of things you can talk about that would happen outside of the octagon regarding this fight, I'm stuck on what would happen inside the octagon and the X's and O's. And like I said, first round, Khamzat Chimaev is the most dominant fighter on the UFC's roster. But when you're going up against a bigger guy, it's exhausting. And especially when you're trying to utilize wrestling to get that person down, to get him on the ground, to hold him there, that can be so exhausting. And one thing we've realized with Alex Pereira is that he's a very patient fighter. And just like everybody else, he has a limit to his gas tank, but he really knows when to press on and when to pull back. And I don't think Khamzat Chimaev has that same knowledge yet. And plus, I think it's just his fighting style. He's going to come forward. The first round basically is always going to go to Chimaev. I would be willing to bet that from this point on, Khamzat Chimaev wins the first round of every fight he's in from here on out, as long as it goes the full duration of 5 minutes. I don't see anybody beating him and beating that pace. But, you know, it's a double-edged sword. If he's going to go out there and go with that sort of tenacity and that sort of pace, he's really going to have to learn how to manage it in the later rounds, especially against a guy that's way bigger than him in Pereira. And if Pereira is able to get some successful takedown defense going, then it's going to be a really long night for him, because while Chimaev looks good on the feet and he is a decent striker, I think he's levels below Alex Pereira, and the longer the fight goes, the more stagnant and stiff still he gets. And that's when he becomes an easier target for his opponents to hit. You saw Kamaru Usman coming in looking very sharp in that third round and even in the second round as he was starting to string his combinations together, and Khamzat just wasn't moving that much, and he also wasn't being very active with his striking. So I think the only way Khamzat Chimaev would be able to get his hand raised against Alex Pereira is if he were to go in there and just try to get him to the ground immediately right from the start of the fight and get a submission. You know,
try to Kevin Holland him.
Exactly. And you know, if Kevin Holland is a seasoned black belt, which he is, can't stop some of those intense jiu-jitsu and grappling rolls that Khamzat was bringing to the table, I believe he could find a submission. But you can't do what Yuri did and go hang out in that kickboxing realm for a little while, because as soon as you start to feel Alex's power, and as soon as he starts to pick up on some of your tendencies, he's going to start to make you pay for it. I think Khamzat Chimaev would have to come in there way less striking heavy like Yuri and go right for double leg takedowns, go right for changing levels, maybe look for a body lock if you have to, but you got to get that big man to the ground ASAP.
Yeah, it's an unlikely fight to happen, but it's fun to break down. And I think with Jamal Hill now being out for some time, Ankalaev and Johnny Walker now have a new date, some things do need to shake out at 205. So who knows? Crazier things have happened. Maybe the UFC says Alex didn't have that hard of a fight against Yuri. He's a hot commodity right now. He's a champion that the UFC is enjoying marketing because he's got such a great stoic and finishing style of fighting. So maybe they say, you know what? In the meantime, we're going to have some fun. We're going to throw two big stars in there and see what shakes out. You couldn't go wrong either way, depending on the outcome of that fight. Whoever wins would become just that much bigger of a star. So you know what? Unlikely, but not impossible.